Hi, this is Krasovsky. I'm a Russian-American Ukrainian Jewish attorney, a former police officer, a human rights, activist or defender. Done a lot of nonprofit work, also emergency medical services work, fire rescue work. And today's video on October 25th is my advice to three groups of people. My advice to Israelis, my advice to Palestinians, and my advice to Jews in general, as well as Arabs, because that's an ethnic group. First of all, what happened on October 7th is a horrific tragedy. First and foremost, my sincere, heartfelt condolences go out to the families of all the victims in Israel who were killed by Hamas terrorist acts and Hamas's incursion. Terrorism can never be justified. Terrorism can never be approved. Terrorism can never be excused. Period. The only thing we can do is try to figure out how people become terrorists, how they're radicalized, how we can prevent that from happening, how we can neutralize them to make sure they don't commit further terrorist acts. And if they already have, we need to bring them to justice, neutralize them to make sure they don't commit any further acts, capture them if possible, bring them to trial, and prosecute them to the fullest extent permitted by law, all the way up to the death penalty. And if they resist during capture and present a threat to people who are capturing them, then they can be liquidated. Those are the rules of law enforcement operations, of anti-terrorist operations, even military operations. But that's not the most important thing. Here's what I want Israelis to consider and remember, because after October 7th, we've seen a lot of hate displayed, not just against the terrorists who committed those heinous acts on Israeli soil and who deserve the hate and who deserve the punishment that they hopefully will get, but hate directed at Palestinians in general, at residents of Gaza in general, at Arabs, and even hate toward Muslims who may not be Arab. Let's look at the biggest Muslim countries in the world. Indonesia, definitely not Arab. But before you start hating and before you start cheering, or if you already have, about how Gaza currently is being pulverized, let's do a sensible, logical analysis of what happened. Because your first and foremost priority as Israeli citizens has to be to ensure your safety, to ensure your security, right? Both short-term and long-term. And the second consideration is you have to live by not just God's laws, which is very subjective depending on what God you believe in, the God of Abraham or perhaps some other God. But you also have to live by domestic and international law. In order not to lose the respect, in order not to lose the support of the international community, of Jews outside of Israel, of non-Jews, and also in order not to lose your conscience. So let's do a quick analysis. I'm sorry for the long intro. Before October 7th, and I'm just going to use my background and expertise in law enforcement, security, intelligence operations, things like that. Before October 7th, the border with Gaza was heavily patrolled, heavily fortified. To breach that border was no easy feat. Before October 7th of 2023, let's go back of when Israeli forces and Israeli settlers withdrew from Gaza in 2005. And then several years later, Hamas came into political power and gained political control of the entire Gaza Strip, having displaced Arafat's Fatah movement. Since 2005 to 2023, 18 years have elapsed? Israeli Defense Forces, Tzahal, Israeli Security Forces, Shin Bet, and Israeli Foreign Intelligence, the Mossad, have had plenty of opportunity in all the required funding and infrastructure and assets, both technical and human assets, to fully control and know of what was happening in the Gaza Strip and within Hamas. You say, well, not true. It's hard to get Palestinians who live in Gaza to cooperate, especially active Hamas members who are committed jihadists and are willing to sacrifice their life as martyrs or shaheeds, things like that. But let's get real, folks. Let's look at human intelligence. The vast majority of Gaza residents work in Israel. They go to work in Israel. There's no work in Gaza because it's been blockaded pretty much since 2005. A severe economic blockade that basically builds nothing but misery and hate. And also is fertile breeding ground for extremist groups like Hamas to recruit members who have nothing else to do because there's no work, there's no manufacturing and things like that. Anyway, the Palestinian workers that go work in Israel, do you think it's difficult to recruit them? No, not for the Shin Bet boys. It's fairly straightforward. You come to a Palestinian and say, hey, listen, you're going to have to work for us. You're going to be our snitch. You're going to be our agent. We need you to spy on people that you know in Hamas. They may even be your relatives. They may be your neighbors. But it's an offer you can't refuse. Because if you refuse, number one, we're not going to let you into Israel to work anymore. And not just you, if necessary, your relatives, cousins, brothers, sisters, whoever comes and works in Israel that's important to you. Number two, if that's not enough punishment for you, because you think you'll be able to get by the Gaza Strip, will, through the agents that we already have, the confidential informants, our spies, our snitches, will put across the message that you're already working for us. And if we've done our job right, we'll back up that message with verifiable intelligence that you supposedly already provided us within the last 2 to 3 months that has already resulted in the arrest, capture, or killing of current Hamas members or dismantling of their operations, tunnels, whatever. So here you are, let's say, a civilian, law-abiding Gaza resident who is not a Hamas militant. You're just a worker, you have a family to feed, you're barely getting by, because we know the poverty levels in Gaza. And this is what the Israeli Shin Bet tells you. You either work with us or you're going to die. And then your family's going to get hurt. Because families of traitors in the West Bank and in Gaza, people who have been outed as working spying for Israel, they don't just get ostracized. Right? Men in that family can be beaten, killed, whatever. So what are you going to do as a father? What are you going to do as a son? Do you want that embarrassment to your parents, to your wife and children, and your brothers, sisters, your cousins? This is going to bring shame in your family. You have no choice. So you start cooperating and giving Israeli intelligence, live intelligence, on what you know what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And since things are so confined in that small area, you can get a lot of information. Especially if you have relatives who have Hamas militants, because people talk. Now, the second part of intelligence is obviously Israel controls all the communications in Gaza. Cell communications are not difficult to intercept and decipher. Even instant messengers, whether it's WhatsApp, Signal, Viber, Telegram, whatever is used, right? Not to mention regular GSM cellular calls or landline calls. Radio transmissions, even using encrypted radio handsets, are still interceptable. If people are using wired communications within the Gaza Strip, well, those can be tapped using your agents, using your spies, who you've technically prepared in Israel to be able to tap into those landlines. Not to mention satellite surveillance, not to mention drone surveillance. In other words, Israeli security apparatus, both military intelligence, internal domestic intelligence, Shin Bet, and the Mossad, have a very clear picture of what's happening with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and they've had it since Hamas came to power. We're not even getting into issues of who supported Hamas coming to power as part of this divide and conquer strategy to weaken Fatah, right? Former Arafat's organization, and former PLO. Well, guess what? When you use radical extremists to weaken more moderate opponents who may be more effective against you politically because they're moderate and people support them, you're going to get blowback, and they can come back and bite you in your ass, as they say, pardon my French. But anyway, so you have a heavily monitored strip with lots of intelligence. Also, for rockets to be built, for weapons to be smuggled in, for ammunition to be smuggled in, all these components, all the military equipment that the Hamas militants used in their incursion in Israel on October 7th. They had to get it in somehow. They didn't get it in by sea because we know how effectively the Israeli Navy enforces the sea blockade of Gaza. So obviously they got it through the Egyptian border, bribing Egyptian border guards, Egyptian customs officers, building tunnels, things like that. You don't think Israeli intelligence, using signals intelligence, using human sources, not just in the Gaza Strip, but also among Egyptians, right? You don't think Israeli intelligence knew what was coming into the Gaza Strip over the last 18 years? Well, if they didn't, they should all be fired, if demoted and possibly prosecuted, right? But we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay. So you have a territory with a hostile force controlling it, hostile to Israel. Hamas is a radical organization affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood that it has announced many years that it does not recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a state and does not recognize its right to exist. Their approach is very straightforward. This is Palestinian land. We have lived here for thousands of years. You guys show up, tell us you lived here 2,000 years ago before the Romans expelled you, right, after the first and the second uprisings. And now you expect us to, leave our homes and give you your historical homeland. Well, this is our historical homeland too. I'm not going to get into that argument, whether it's right or wrong, but we know how difficult it is to have these theologically based arguments. Because everyone has their version of God, everyone has their version of who the most important prophet is, whether it's Abraham, Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, or whoever else. So once you start arguing over faith and belief, who's right? Usually, holy wars, religious wars, have shown that the party that's right is the party that wins the war, because it dominates the battlefield and can defeat the enemy militarily and then persecute people who are opposed to its faith. I'm not condoning that. I think it's a big tragedy because I believe everyone has the right to their own belief in God, and you shouldn't force it upon other people. But anyway, comes October 7th, and what do we have? We have Hamas militants, supposedly without any foreknowledge by Israeli intelligence officials and military officials, storm the border. They're using motorcycles, they're using jeeps, they're using dune buggies, paragliders, explosives to destroy the fence, bolt cutters. They're using drones to disable watch stations or automatic machine gun stations that are remotely operated. They're destroying communication posts. It's Saturday, it's Shabbat, Sukkot just ended, people are probably relaxed, not ready. You have a whole bunch of innocent, naive ravers at this Nova festival that, whose location was supposed to be secret till the end, to make it really cool. Yeah, next to the Gaza Strip, great idea. And these folks basically were turned into sacrificial lambs. But they crossed the border, and as we saw from subsequent footage, a good number of these Hamas militants, not all, but a good number, started to act like terrorists, became terrorists, because what they did was they broke the rules of war. They broke rules that establish what are crimes against humanity, war crimes, and things like this. They attacked innocent, unarmed civilians. They attacked unarmed or already defenseless soldiers. So we know what they did. Horrific stuff. This is savagery. This is like middle age kind of things that we hoped, well, we're already past that. Although, why were we hoping if these things happened not that long ago in many places around the world? Look at the 1990s Yugoslavia, how neighbors butchered neighbors. But let's get back to the tactical issue. Okay, so they breach the border, and they're able to operate without any real Israeli army opposition or law enforcement opposition for hours, if not days. If I'm not mistaken, the last Hamas fighters, terrorists, were liquidated or captured by Israeli forces on the 8th or the 9th, the next day or even 2 days later, in certain settlements, kibbutzes, that were towns that were close to the Gaza Strip, including even Sderot. And obviously, not to mention, the 5,000 rocket launches in Israel that started on dawn on October 7th. When you launch that many missiles, no matter how effective your Iron Dome is, you'll run out of interceptor missiles. You can't intercept them all. And this is also a war crime because missiles were being launched indiscriminately towards civilian areas. These aren't guided missiles that were, launched toward a particular Israeli military target that's a legitimate target for Palestinian militants because they consider themselves at war with Israel and they don't recognize Israel's legitimacy. But folks, let's ask ourselves the following questions, especially those of you who live in or who have been to Israel, right? First part of my message is directed at Israelis. And we're already at the 17-minute mark. How long does it take to fly from the furthest military airfield in northern Israel for an Apache helicopter or a jet to the border with Gaza? Jets fly 700, 1,000 miles an hour. But they go supersonic faster than that, right? Helicopters fly 150 miles an hour at easy cruising speed. Look at all the military helicopters that Israel has at its disposal. Apache helicopters, Sikorskys, Hueys, things like that. These are all military helicopters that could have easily responded. Okay. So did you see helicopters or jets responding en masse to the alert on the Gaza border within an hour of the incursion, of alarms being set off, of people making phone calls? Because people were able to make cellular phone calls for days, including people who were trapped in kibbutzes and settlements waiting to be rescued, hiding under tanks or vehicles. Cellular communications worked, even in the Gaza Strip, during the whole incursion. So when people give you arguments, all military communications were down, first of all, I don't believe that, because military radios can have a reach of 10, 20 miles easily without needing repeater stations or antennas. And we know the distance from the Gaza Strip to the nearest major towns like Ashkelon or Sderot. It's not far. You can drive in a half an hour. You can drive in an hour, even from Beersheba, right? Think of how long it takes to drive from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to the northern border of the Gaza Strip. Israel is a small country. We're talking about a couple of hours. So folks, ask yourself the question, where was the response and why was there no response? Why were these terrorists, right, these savages allowed to commit these acts? Killing, shooting unarmed civilians, beheading, torturing, beating, all the other horrible stuff that they did. I'm not talking about the exaggerated bullshit propaganda stuff, but the things they actually did that have no justification whatsoever. And they show that people who've been this radicalized and taught to hate Jews in general and Israelis in general this much, including women and children, and who have been taught that it's acceptable to kill women and children, have no place on this earth. Right? I'm not sure they can be rehabilitated ever. So we're talking about lengthy prison sentences, if not death penalties. But why were these people allowed to commit these acts over hours? Where was the response? Okay? Anyone who lives in Israel, you know your society. Everyone serves in the Israeli armed forces pretty much. Right? And then they stay in the reserves. People have guns. Police have not just handguns, but machine guns. How many police officers are in nearest cities, places like Ashkelon, Sderot, Beersheba, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem? How many police could have responded if for some reason the Israeli military was mysteriously missing or unable to, to fight on Shabbat after Sukkot? Where was the organized response? It doesn't take that long to organize, to put together 50 police officers, 50 border guards, or 50 soldiers. Just a small unit. To try to rescue people, to try to stop the carnage. 100 people? Shit, you can organize 100 soldiers if you're a soldier who's in the reserves, just people that you know within a half an hour, and you can start taking off with weaponry and get people to bring in ammunition. I didn't see Hamas fighters operating with armored personnel carriers that would have been impermeable to, let's say, regular, machine gun rounds, NATO rounds, caliber rounds, or even 50 caliber rounds. I didn't see Hamas using tanks. All they were using were motorcycles. They were on foot, or pickup trucks that weren't even armored. So you could have fought against Hamas fighters who were only armed with machine guns, RPGs. Some apparently had surface-to-air missiles, the portable ones that can shoot down helicopters. But still, if you have a sufficient aviation response, ask military helicopter pilots. They'll tell you they can find a target, put it in their sights, and lock on it, being 5-6 miles away. Right? Barely within range of any manpad, shoulder-held manpad that could be used to shoot them down, like a Stinger missile or the Soviet Strela missiles or things like this. Same thing with Israeli tanks, Israeli armored personnel carriers. Sure, they can be brought down with anti-tank missiles or RPGs, but not that easily. And tanks can shoot from a mile away, a mile and a half away. They can provide the appropriate support, especially if they have proper aerial intelligence support. What, people in Israel don't have drones, quadricopters, just civilian ones? Lots of people do, and all law enforcement should, right? They only cost like $200 or $300, $500, and they'll provide you visibility up to 5 or 7 miles away for a half an hour. Look at the drone specs. So where was your response? Why were all these Israeli citizens and foreigners who are in Israel allowed to be killed or taken hostage, captured and taken on foot or by car to the Gaza Strip? This is something suspicious and mysterious, right? You really start thinking about, because could this have been a black flag operation? And by the way, when we analyze of why terrorist acts happen, it doesn't mean in any way we're lessening the evil and the horror of what the terrorists did, nor are we approving it in any way. The terrorist acts, the savagery, the crimes against humanity that the Hamas terrorists committed, not all. We've seen eyewitness testimony from certain Israeli citizens who, Hamas fighters came into their house and didn't hurt them. And they just simply left. Things like that. So we know not all of them were insane, radicalized enough where they hated regular Jews. But some were. I don't know what percentage, but who cares? So why was this allowed to happen? Okay, let's start thinking about why. Now, I've already told you, an adequate response could have been organized easily. There was no response. What's suspicious is what, and this is, I'm not an Israeli intelligence expert, but what I've been reading is that apparently you had 3 brigades assigned to the Gaza border of about 800 people in each brigade, so 2,400 soldiers. And before that, a couple of weeks before that, you had already the conflict in the West Bank between settlers and local Palestinians, where you've had Palestinians attacking settlers, but more importantly, settlers attacking Palestinians. And I do not approve or condone civilian on civilian violence in any way, both as a police officer, former emergency medical technician, paramedic, or fire rescue guy, or just a normal person. That has no place. You're taking the law into your own hands, and that should be punished to the full extent permitted by law. If you're a Palestinian, if you're an Israeli settler who's living in the West Bank against UN resolutions and you're displacing Palestinians, does that give you the right to destroy their olive orchards? No. Does that give you the right to poison or cut off their water supplies? No. Does that give you the right to start assaulting, harassing, intimidating local Palestinian villagers in an effort to get them to move so your settlement expands? No, that does not give you a right. Neither does it give Palestinians the right to start pummeling civilian cars with rocks where you can kill civilian occupants and drivers of those vehicles. Right? This is taking the law into your own hands. If you believe a settler's on your land illegally, then report it to your authorities. If your authorities are helpless, then what are you going to do? If you take the law into your hands, you've turned yourself into a combatant. What are you going to do? Enact a citizen's arrest and say, I arrest you, I detain you by the authority of our non-recognized Palestinian state, and I'm going to, take you over to the local jail in Ramallah or Jenin or wherever it's going to be, or Nablus. You know what the response is going to be, both from Israeli forces, from other settlers, and even from your own Palestinian leadership. They say, listen, it's not going to work as you'll see what happens in exchange. Same thing with Israeli settlers. If you believe that you're living lawfully in the West Bank, Samaria, whatever it's called, and you're being harassed by local Palestinians because they don't want you there, in other words, they're committing acts of vandalism against you, they're throwing rocks, which is assault, potentially aggravated assault against you, you have the right to defend yourself. You should also consider, maybe I should move to be safe. But if you believe you have fervor, your ideology, your religious commitment tells you this is my land and I need to be here because this is the land of my ancestors, just like the Palestinians say, this is the land of their ancestors, you've got competing viewpoints, then defend yourself. But do not use excessive force, right? The right to defend yourself, the defense has to be commensurate with the force used against you. Okay. So let's get back to what happened on October 7th. What we have is a failure of Israeli leadership because they either allowed this to happen for political reasons, to then get carte blanche authority and the anger and the hate and the international support to start liquidating Hamas, because apparently maybe Hamas was no longer useful anymore and now was becoming a real threat, and maybe they were concerned that their supporters and ideology would even spread to the West Bank, which would be even a bigger disaster. Right? You already have an issue with Hezbollah in Lebanon on the northern border. So this could have been a motivating factor that, okay, we know what they're planning. The Egyptians say they warned us. Our intelligence assets and our signals intelligence and satellite and everything else, both in Gaza and on the Egyptian side, we knew, the military capacity that they accumulated over the years. We knew their plans, and we said, let them try, and then we'll have full authority to deal a crushing blow and take care of this, Gaza problem once and for all. Okay. If you're an Israeli citizen, do you approve of that? Would you approve a black flag operation like this? And if it wasn't a black flag operation, then your political and military leadership and intelligence leadership and security leadership, they're incompetent. If they allow this to happen, all of these people should have been fired on the spot. First thing you do when this happens, obviously you take all necessary measures to stop the terrorists, to try to rescue hostages, to liquidate them, to secure your border. That's a day or two. After you've neutralized further threats, before you start anything, who are you going to have lead this effort? The same people who allowed this to happen? No, they've already proven their incompetence or their complicity for whatever reasons. You fire them, you get rid of them. Netanyahu, gone. Okay? The head of Israeli Defense Forces, gone. Head of Shin Bet, fired. Head of Mossad, fired. Okay? If the head of the local Israeli police involved, fire him or her as well. Border Service, fired. It's that simple. Because you allowed Hamas militants and terrorists to come into Israeli soil and kill over, what's the count, over 1,500 Israelis? And look at the percentage of those killed who were women and children. That's her. And the thousands of Israelis injured, not just from the Hamas incursion, but from the massive, missile barrage. What, you didn't know these guys had so many missiles? Really? You weren't keeping track of the imports of steel that's required to build these missiles or aluminum? You weren't keeping track of the propulsive stuff that's used for missile propulsion, right? Whether it's solid state or whatever else they used for propulsion, right? Like they're using multiple rocket launch systems, military systems. You didn't realize how explosives were being imported in or manufactured, right? They have explosive warheads. That's why you launch missiles, right? You didn't know any of that? How about the electronics involved? Or you didn't realize they were digging tunnels? Golly gee whiz, when people dig tunnels, they have to displace their dirt somewhere. They have to have tunnel digging equipment. People aren't just digging tunnels just with shovels, right? More sophisticated equipment is used to dig them, to maintain them, make sure they don't collapse. Concrete is used and wood for walls, reinforcement, electrical systems, water pumps, all sorts of stuff. You missed on all this? You missed on all the plans, especially giving your human intelligence assets that have no choice but to cooperate with you? Or if it's true that you've supported Hamas leadership through back channels, then you would have known about this. The other gold rule you may not know about terrorism is as follows. Let's take one step back. Number one, there are no independent terrorist organizations as far as I know. I'm 55 years old, I've studied this and worked with this long enough. There are no independent terrorist organizations. Every terrorist organization is under the control or the influence of a particular country's security service or intelligence services. Why? Because you can't compete with state-owned security or intelligence agencies. They have vast resources. They can do all sorts of things to you. The use of terrorists cannot even, retaliate against it. Also including against your, relatives and family and stuff like that. So terrorists are used and controlled to do certain things that are in the interest of that particular intelligence agency that controls them. This may not be known, and it's definitely not known to the terrorist agency's rank and file usually, right? They're kept in the dark. They're following their ideological agenda. They've been radicalized, brainwashed, programmed, indoctrinated to do what they do, to sacrifice their lives, and they've already justified inside their heads that it's okay to attack civilian targets and civilians. Kill them, maim them, blow them up, whatever. Stab them, doesn't matter. These people have been radicalized. But the top leadership of the intelligence agency, of this terrorist organization, knows who its handlers, who its curators are, right? From the intelligence agency that control them. So whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, let's look at Africa. You got Al-Shabaab or whatever it's called in Somalia. You've got the Boko Haram people in Nigeria. You have other groups in Libya, in Niger, and doesn't matter. They're all under the control of some intelligence agents. Okay? So let that sink in and understand these things, they don't just happen. Because they're under control of the intelligence agencies, they follow certain rules. And one of the rules is, by the way, I'm not talking about, the lone wolf terrorist who got indoctrinated on his own on the internet or some chat group. Although a lot of groups, you do have intelligence agency people who monitor them and even promote them and entrap them. We've seen in the U.S. a lot, where a lot of the people who thought they were pledging allegiance to ISIS or to Al Qaeda were pledging allegiance to the FBI. All right. And the same thing happens abroad. They think they're pledging allegiance to ISIS or Al Qaeda. They're pledging allegiance to either Jordanian intelligence or assets, or Mossad assets, or CIA assets, or whoever else, whoever has an effective and ruthless, cruel intelligence service. Whether it's Iranian or Pakistani, or doesn't matter. But anyway, one of the things they do is, you commit terrorist acts to reach your political objectives or your ideological religious objectives. And there are particular unwritten rules. Before you commit the act, you give the other side your demands. You announce your demands. Hey, this is what I'm demanding. You have to release my fighters who are captured. You have to remove your forces from this land, or you have to give us this, or you have to give us that. And if you don't, then we're going to hit you. Because they're closely linked to intelligence agencies, there's another unwritten rule. You have to give minimal warning to make sure that relatives of intelligence service or security service members don't get hurt in the local areas, or their financial interests, because it's also about money, and we'll get to that in a second. So usually a warning is given. First, the demand is issued, and if the demand is not met, then a warning is given at the last minute or minimum. Look, this is our unwritten rule. Remove your relatives, you remove your intelligence assets, but you can't warn the civilian population, because if you do, then we're not going to give you any more warnings in the future, right? The civilians are sheep. They don't need to be warned, right? We're in the know, we're in the game, we warn each other. That's the rule. And sad enough, so if you look at big terrorist acts, that's the rule that's present in those big terrorist acts as well. Someone said among Israeli leadership, this is our 9/11, like in the U.S. Well, let's think about 9/11, right? I don't even want to go there. I'm sure the U.S. was taken completely by surprise, right? By guys who could barely fly planes, who for some reason received money from people in Saudi Arabia, received support from people affiliated with Pakistani intelligence. Some were even had, from what I understand, affiliation or some connection, or were being monitored by Mossad intelligence agents. They were able to pull this off. Fly planes at high speed into buildings, and all of a sudden the jet fuel melted steel beams, and the buildings came down at the speed of free fall, and despite all those steel beams, and for some reason they found thermite, at the wreckage site, which is an explosive used in building demolition. And another building, because they felt it was damaged, had to be. We made a decision to pull it. They all said it on TV, right? It takes weeks of planting explosives to properly demolish or pull a building. I guess they must have known ahead of time. All sorts of stuff, but let's not talk. So these are similarities, right? But political objectives were gained at the expense of innocent American lives, which is a tragedy, and my heartfelt condolences and respects to the victims' families. May their loved ones who died rest in peace. And I always say, every 9/11, the people who are responsible for this need to be brought to justice, because if they're not, I'm not talking about the low stuff who's involved, because if they're not brought to justice, they'll do it again, and that's in every country, whether it's attacks on London subway system, or terrorist acts in Paris on a major scale. Or often all these people who commit these terrorist acts have already been on the radar screen of security agencies and their databases. They're known to authorities, but for some reason, they're permitted to commit these terrorist acts. And then security agencies get budgets, military-industrial complexes get further government budgets. People make money, including defense contractors, intelligence contractors. It's all about money. The other thing that you need to recognize, and to put all this into perspective for you, is, as far as I know, when we look at major Western governments, they're all controlled surreptitiously by large transnational financial industrial groups. Why? Well, a while back, rich people realized that if you're the equivalent of today's billionaire, who's going to be able to take all this stuff away from you? Not your local mob. You can get, your own private army to take care of that. It's the sovereign, it's the government who can take things away and deprive you of life and property and assets. So if you want to make sure that you have the best sufficient asset preservation scheme going, asset protection scheme, well, the only effective asset protection scheme is to control the government. That could take everything away from you. And how do you control it? You buy political parties, you buy politicians, you buy elected officials, appointed officials. When you have billions, when you have lots of billions, hey, people would say, look, if you want to protect your assets, you should be willing to spend even up to 5 or 10% of your assets value per year. Imagine if you have 100 billion and you can spend 10 billion on buying influence. Some politicians are like prostitutes. You give them money, they do what you tell them to do. Political party hacks, local political party organizations. So you end up controlling governments. And when you control the government, you don't just control the legislative branch, right? You also control the judicial branch because judges are appointed by politicians or elected, and elections are easy to control when you own the press. And if you're wealthy enough, you always realize you have to control the press, right? That's important. So these are the things that are happening. But you also get to control the military. Right? This is the executive branch, right? The Foreign Service, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You get to control the Foreign Intelligence Service because you control the government. And needless to say, within the government that you control, you need to have people who report to you of what's happening, that people are properly protecting your corporate interests. In other words, you have to have snitches, spies within the government, who will make sure that the managers that you've had elected or appointed do their job, even if these managers are presidents or vice presidents or prime ministers. So this is how things work. And because you're transnational, you're doing it on a worldwide scale these days. This is the result of globalism today. Because you're doing it on a worldwide scale, there are lots of chess pieces at play. You want to, plus you're also making money from the government that you control through government contracts, right? When you own, you own banks, you own military industrial complex, you own other major government contractors that are involved in healthcare, right? Especially if you control big pharma. And the government healthcare system pays for prescription drugs, pays for vaccines, pays for medical equipment. Especially if you control production and import of energy carriers, oil, gas, electrical energy, hydropower, if you own dams, if you own coal mines, you have lots of interests that can be used to further your goals and to make sure that the local population, you're also making money from taxpayers because who's paying the interest on the loans you provide to the government? The taxpayers, right? You're making money from taxpayers for all these expenditures on military budgets, on law enforcement, criminal justice system budgets. You got to incarcerate people now in private prisons. Make money from that too. Your armed forces are deployed abroad. Hey, they need to be fed. They need fuel. They need all sorts of support, right? Communications. And if you own major communications companies, including satellite ones, perfect. If you own airlines that are contracted to ferry soldiers over when the regular military airplanes aren't enough, you make money from that too, and from ships that are used to ferry supplies. Plus, you're a military-industrial complex stakeholder, so you get to build ships and make money. You get to build tanks and make money, airplanes and everything else. Israel is no exception, folks. Israel is no exception. So what is this telling you? It's telling you as follows. On October 7th, you guys, as Israeli citizens, became pawns, right, in a particular game. How did you become pawns? Well, I don't believe that the leadership of the Mossad, Shin Bet, and Israeli Defense Forces are dumb, clueless people who didn't have sufficient intelligence to know of what Hamas was going to do. Either that day or sooner or later. They knew. I don't believe when people say, we didn't know. They knew. So they let this happen for particular political reasons. And now it's easy to sell those political reasons to you. Imagine if your political leadership is being investigated for corruption and they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out of office and locked up and imprisoned for corruption. But an event like this happens, all of a sudden you're the national leader. Oh, I'm going to unite everyone. I'm going to defend everyone. Yeah, you were so successful in defending us that this is what happened to us on October 7th. But now everyone forgets about any investigations against you or your group or people in your party because they're too busy now considering how we're going to get revenge. Well, if you want to get revenge, you better get revenge against who? The terrorists who did this. If you think you're going to enact revenge against their ethnicity, Palestinians in general, if you think you're going to enact revenge against the entire civilian population of the area where they're based, the Gaza Strip, well, then you're on your way to war crimes. Now, as Israeli citizens, you're not the ones who get to make those decisions. And as Jews around the world, we don't get to make those decisions on behalf of the Israeli Defense Forces or Shin Bet or the Mossad. But we end up having to deal with the consequences. All of us end up having to deal with the consequences. And the consequences of when, after such a blunder or such a horrific black flag operation, in revenge you start indiscriminately bombing Gaza without allowing the local population to evacuate. And remember, Gaza is not an independent country. Palestine doesn't have its own independent state. So if you're at war with a particular terrorist group that has gotten control, or political group like Hamas that's gotten control of this territory, you still have a responsibility to those citizens, the non-combatant civilians. Before you start anti-terrorist operations, and I've discussed this in my other video, what do you have to do? You have to safely evacuate people. So in other words, you have to set up facilities to where they can be evacuated to. Tent cities with heating if it's necessary, with air conditioning if it's necessary, with water supplies, food supplies, medical supplies, educational facilities for little kids. And this is what gets me really mad as a father of 5 children. Children are always innocent. Even the children were the brothers or sisters, small minor kids of a terrorist who, cut off people's heads in Israel, heaven forbid, or who killed innocent Israeli women and children on October 7th or October 8th. It doesn't matter. The little kids did not have a choice of who is their relative, who's their father, their brother, their uncle, whatever. They didn't have a choice of where they were born, whether it's the Gaza Strip or Genoa in Italy, right? They didn't have a choice of what ethnicity they were born into, whether they were born Arabs, Palestinians, Jews, or Israelis, or whoever else, or Persians, Iranians. They didn't have a choice. They're innocent. They have to be protected. And if you properly protect them, and then you prevent them in the future from being indoctrinated to hate Jews, to hate Israelis, and you don't give them grounds to hate Jews and hate Israelis, then this is how you resolve the conflict. But if after this whole disaster on October 7th, you start going, man, our guys are doing a great job. Look, we're dropping bombs, man. We're leveling Gaza. They should get out to Egypt. We'll evict them like what? Like people were evicted in 1948, 1949? People left because they were afraid of the Israeli forces' atrocities that were committed against Arab villages. And they took place. We have lots of documentary evidence from the people who even did this on video. Old guys telling how they indiscriminately killed unarmed Arab civilians when they were, their job was to clear the land for the state of Israel. This is ruthless Zionist thinking. I can never agree, I can never approve killing people or unlawfully displacing them. If someone tells you, well, you have to because this is what our God told us, then I say, you know what, I'm not a religious fundamentalist. I believe in holy texts, I respect them, I believe in rituals, I observe them, but I also understand that all these things were written by people. They may have had revelations, but they were still people with particular mindsets at a particular historical period, with also particular political and religious objectives. So that's that. So let's not destroy ourselves. So my message for Israelis is, guys, don't support what's being done in Gaza now. Obviously, Israeli troops, and we have to support them 100%, have to go into Gaza to neutralize, to find and neutralize the terrorists that committed terrorist acts in Israel, right? Or if they're legitimate military targets because they attacked Israeli military outposts on October 7th, same thing. You do what you have to do if you're at war, right? But when you start doing this, resulting in the death now of, what were the casualty figures now? Over, I think, like 1,500, close to 2,000 dead Palestinian children. We see these pictures all the time. You're not going to see them on your network TV. Go to the internet. Go to Twitter. Go to Telegram channels. You will see all this. Obviously, Facebook is going to block it. YouTube is going to block it. Although it doesn't block all of it. And you're going to see the carnage. What's going to happen is we're going to build hate against ourselves. And nothing good will come of it. So while we have to support our troops, because they have to go in and they have to deal with the people who did this on October 7th. In parallel, we also have to deal with the people who are responsible for it on the Israeli side. Right? Are responsible for letting this happen or allowing it to happen on purpose for political objectives. And when you look at political objectives, always the big political objectives are what? One of the biggest political objectives, it's always about money. Sure, money is to be made from war, right? Money can be made from war. But the other thing you have to consider is this. People look at bigger targets. And the biggest target that we're dealing with is in the region that's opposed to the interests of the financial industrial groups that control Israeli government, that control Western governments. Well, they're not hard to identify. Iran is the biggest player that's opposed. Then we have smaller Syria, right? And then we also have Lebanon, at least the part of it that's controlled by Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran, right? Shiite Hezbollah is supported by Iran. So, folks, let's think about this long and hard. The last thing any one of us wants to be, whether you're a Jew who lives abroad or you're an Israeli citizen or Israeli resident, is to become a pawn, an expendable pawn in a political chess game, whose family can potentially suffer from the blowback. If things continue going on this way, if we keep on wantonly bombing or shelling the Gaza Strip and killing Palestinian women and children there, who are just being buried under buildings, who weren't properly evacuated anywhere. And you can't force this on Egypt. Hey, you have to take these people. Egypt's going to go, no, we don't want them. Plus, we're not going to participate in the expulsion of Palestinians from their land. You build shell cities, in particular safeguarded, neutral refuge areas in the Gaza Strip or on the territory of Israel next to the Gaza Strip. Hey, you guys want to evacuate them to the West Bank and organize it? Well, get 1,000 buses together and organize all this. You're also going to have to organize medical evacuations. When you cut off water and electrical and fuel supplies, you're committing war crimes, because this isn't just going to harm the military fighters. The military will always have their reserves that they won't share with the local population, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to kill innocent people who are going to be dying from lack of electricity in hospitals, lack of water or sewage in hospitals, lack of medication, right? Lack of working medical equipment, especially in trauma wards, right? People are going to start dying from diseases that result from poor hygiene, whether it's cholera or other stuff, right? Different viruses. People's immune systems are already compromised. People are going to be malnourished. That kills your immune system when you're not getting enough food or enough water. You're going to be killing civilians, some immediately by bombs or being crushed or trapped under collapsed buildings. The other ones you're going to kill slowly within a week or two, because they're not going to have enough food and water. They're going to get sick and die. Or the injured ones are not going to be able to get proper medical care and they'll die. And who's going to be blamed for this? The Israeli government, but the government represents the people. And Israel is a Jewish state, so everyone gets blamed. Not just Israelis, but also Jews. So while I fully support going after terrorists, militants, if Hamas is a terrorist organization that cannot be reformed, and its objective is to wipe Israel off the map and kill all Jews, and because I haven't seen any trials of the Hamas militants who committed these war crimes on October 7th, right? Hamas supports them as its good fighters, heroes, and maybe even gave them, medals, awards. Well, if that's what your organization does, then your organization is a legitimate target. But unfortunately, we'll have to deal with it with a ground incursion, and we're going to incur casualties. And my heart goes out to the families and to the soldiers who lose their lives and their families. But in anti-terrorist operations, it's unavoidable, right? If you know a terrorist is hiding in a building with women and children, you have to go in and get them. If you go, hell no, man, I'm going to blow up the whole building, and I could care less about the women and children because the women and children are his ethnicity, are his religion, are his race, or are even his family members or neighbors. His responsibility. If he chose to hide among them, then it's on him. No, guys, it may be on him from a moral point of view, but these people had no say in it, right? Children, by definition, have no say in it because they're not independent. If a woman says, well, I'm going to stand by my terrorist husband and I'm not going to leave him, and I know I risk being killed or I'm going to try to protect him, then obviously that's on her. That's the choice that she made when she had an opportunity to be evacuated. But not children. They don't have that opportunity. Or even if a child makes that decision, that's not the decision of a fully grown person that you have to respect. Right? They're not of sufficient age to make those life-determining decisions. So we're going to lose soldiers. And it's sad, but why we're losing soldiers? Because we allowed this shit to happen in the first place. We allowed Hamas to get into power. We allowed Hamas to grow. Because some geniuses in the Israeli government, right, or think tanks or whatever else, thought that, hey, this is going to be a good opposing force to Fatah. And we'll be able to control them. Because all terrorist organizations are controlled. Yeah, it's like, well, this is like controlling tigers or controlling pit bulls or a python, or sooner or later it can get out of control. You may lose control. And that animal will turn against you. Will bite the hand that feeds it, or that helped it grow. So, on that note, whatever you have to do as Israeli citizens, whatever you have to do as Jews around the world, we have to take steps to convince the Israeli armed forces to stop the indiscriminate bombing, this prosecution of the anti-terrorist organization that's causing needless loss of civilian lives, especially women and children. Even if these women and children are related to Hamas terrorists and militants. Doesn't matter, right? Because all these photos of children that get circulated around the Muslim world are going to do nothing but build hate against Israel and against Jews, right? And will also help radicalize future generations of people who will say, we're going to avenge the dead Palestinian children of Gaza. And we're going to avenge them not just by attacking Israeli military targets, we're going to avenge them by attacking civilian Jews that feed the system with their taxes, right? That feed the system with their support, with their contributions, with their donations around the world. So this is blowback. It's going to turn Jews around the world into targets. It's going to destroy decades, if not centuries, of normal lives where there was very little tension between Jews and their local communities, right? Among the Jewish diaspora in various countries where we, the Jews, are always the minority. This is something to think about. My message to Palestinians, look, if you feel you've been displaced unlawfully from your land, then I feel sorry for you. I support you. I support any people who've been unlawfully disenfranchised or displaced or discriminated upon. If you believe you're living in an apartheid state, my heart goes out to you. But supporting local radicals is never the solution. If you guys support, whether it's Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, and their commission of crimes against Israeli civilians, this is not going to help your cause, because it'll only justify the unlawful measures that have been used against you, especially if the system is stacked against you, because you have large financial industrial groups who control governments, who control armed forces working against you. All right? And if this thing gets bigger and the target is places like Iran, what do you think is going to happen when Iran starts launching missiles at Israel or at U.S. assets in the Middle East? And Hezbollah starts doing the same thing. Right? We've just hit 1 hour mark. You're going to have horrible consequences. And that could be used to completely expel you from the West Bank. And I don't believe that Palestinians have to be, who lived on, the Israeli proper before 1948 when it was founded, before 1967, who lived there since, deserve to be evicted. I know this is your historical land. Your grandparents lived there, people 2, 3, 4, or 500 years back, from your family. Who keeps track of their ancestors, more than 200 or 300 years, unless they're famous and they were able to build records or hold political office. But people have lived there historically. You deserve to live there. You don't deserve to be evicted. You don't deserve to be treated as second-class citizens. Okay? I'm against discrimination, apartheid, exploitation in any form in any country, whether it's against Palestinians, whether it's against people of African heritage, of Native American heritage, of, in Asia, doesn't really matter. Look what's done to Aborigines in Australia. What moral person would even support that? Or other indigenous groups that have been persecuted, whose lands were taken away for political and for financial reasons, right? People were evicted from their lands, their communities destroyed, their nations, their tribes destroyed. Let's look at Native Americans in America, in Canada, even in Mexico and in South America. It's not fair, and I would never support that to any people. So my appeal to Palestinians and to Arabs is, guys, I respect Islam as a religion, but I also encourage you never to support, never to follow religious or political leaders that advocate supremacy. Because once you start advocating supremacy, this is what the Nazis did, right? Aryan supremacy. Look at what the Crusaders did. Oh, supremacy of Christians. That's used to kill other people. And you never try to convert people of other religions to your faith. Don't force them. And if you start treating people of other faiths as second-class citizens in your country, depriving them of their, equal rights, equal protection under the law, the right to freely worship and gather and assemble, you start destroying their houses of worship, destroying their religious schools. This is a moral dead end sooner or later. Moral, spiritual dead end. So never support political leaders like that. Even if you feel that people around you are infidels, idolaters, pagans, whoever. Listen to me. At the end of the day, let's say before Judgment Day, before death, we have 3 guys. One guy is a Muslim, another is a Jew, another is a Christian, 4th guy, let's say, is a pagan who worships, the sun or trees or the water. And they've all done equal good deeds. They've lived equal lives. They haven't sinned. They've lived good lives. They haven't harmed anyone. They've helped people. And they die. What do you think? That all of a sudden on the other side, you didn't believe in the right God. You're not going to see any paradise. Because all the good things you did in the name of the sun and nature, right? Because you believe in harmony with nature. But you didn't believe in the God of Abraham, right? Our God. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's how God works. An entity, we can't even call it an entity. We can't even call it a force. Something that permeates and controls the entire universe with millions of galaxies, if not billions, trillions of stars, how many planets, and who knows how much intelligent life. Okay? This is like thinking that, we humans are going to pass judgment on little ants or bacteria that we don't even know about, right? Dust mites that are in our books. And the dust mite says, you did something wrong. You see, you ate that page, and, now the big guy is going to be mad against you. And this is why he took the book off the shelf. This is silly stuff, right? So please, don't support religious or political leaders that will encourage you to discriminate against other faiths, against other nationalities, or persecute them, or ever justify terrorist acts. If you have a political or religious leader that's justifying terrorist acts, kick them out of office. Don't support them. And if you can't do that, move, run, because nothing good will come of it. Not, blood calls for more bloodshed, right? This eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, like on a karmic level. It's like karma. Don't go there. But also understand what you're facing. You're facing globalists, transnational capitalists who have no God. Their God is money. Their God is political power. And to keep that wealth and to expand that wealth, they will do anything. They're willing to kill hundreds of thousands of people to make extra billions. And for a trillion, probably wipe out, a whole small country. Because it's $1 trillion, right? So these people are basically Satanists. When I mean Satanist, the definition of evil of when you do what brings you benefit or pleasure, disregarding the fact that the same act brings suffering and pain upon other people. Because it's for me. I only care about myself. If following God's laws means, serving God means following God's laws, I'm not interested in that. I want to live for myself. This is like Satanism, Luciferianism. If these are the people you're dealing with, and you're dealing with governments that they control, then guess what? All good people have to unite, right? Because otherwise, these people are going to use divide and conquer. And do you want to be on the receiving end of divide and conquer? Of course you don't. Because that's how the bad guys win. So I'd rather see a country where Christians, Jews, Muslims, other faiths, Buddhists, Hindus, Confucianists, Taoists, I can't even go through all the Baha'i faith, the Sikhs, they all unite around a common moral theological compass to protect our society, our traditional way of life, and to protect our children from evil influences. So our children don't grow up to be moral degenerates that are selfish and feel they can do anything they want to do for their own pleasure or benefit, even though it's harmful to society, harmful to their families, harmful to their communities. That's my approach, okay? Every nation has a right to statehood, right? If someone said, listen, the gypsies, after they left northern India, after the withdrawal of the Muslim invasion of northern India, if they deserve a homeland, well, someone should consider allocating land to them so they can have a gypsy state if they want it. Let's look at the Kurds. It's a huge tragedy that the Kurds don't have their own country, because a chunk of their land is in Turkey, another part is in Iraq, another part is in Syria, another part is in Iran. What, none of those countries could afford to allocate like 10% of their land, and so you can have a Kurdish state? But we know how wealthy people and politicians think. If those lands have oil or other wealthy natural resources, they'll never give them up, right? Because wealthy people, if you tell a wealthy person, someone's got 10 billion, hey, just give us 1 billion, for women and children, for educational programs, for health programs, and you try to take that billion away from him, even though he'll have 9 billion left, he'll kill you, and he'll kill your entire family to keep the billion. That's how wealthy people work. That their God and their justifier for anything, including use of force to protect and further their wealth, is money. So while we confront all this, we as moral people have to agree that every people are entitled to have their state. And this goes for Jews. Remember, when the Jews were expelled by the Romans, it was for what? Because Israel was pretty much at the time the only Roman colony that had enough guts to stand up to the Roman Empire. They stood up to the Roman Empire in 66, and then they had another revolt in 134. Unfortunately, they couldn't beat the Roman legions. Right? The Roman legionnaires, many of whom were basically mercenaries who were promised if they served Rome, and they survived, they'd get land and pensions and things like that. No one gave pensions. They just gave you land that you could work off, and that was your pension. And these legionnaires were willing to die and enforce Roman rule. That's how Rome became wealthy. But you can't blame the Jews for that. And what I always find funny is people forget that Judaism is the root Abrahamic faith, right? Christianity came out of Judaism. Islam came out of Judaism. Also Christian influence as well, considering, from what I understand, the knowledge of Christianity among Fatima's relatives, Muhammad's wife, Prophet Muhammad's wife. So to say that you people have wandered around the world for 2,000 years, now you don't deserve to come back and have an Israeli state? Listen, that's just not serious, and that's not fair or morally correct. So I'm all for the state of Israel. Obviously, I'm not an objective person because I'm a Jew by faith, but I'm all for the state of Israel. But I'm not for the state of Israel that's going to, deprive Palestinians of having their own state or make them second-class citizens within Israel, because it's not fair. You have to be fair to people. You have to be fair and respectful of your neighbors. But that has to work both ways. And hate does not build respect. Hate does not build fairness. Hate leads to violence. Well, violence leads to bloodshed and loss of life. And then you get the retaliation, and then you get the revenge. And you can have these endless feuds that last hundreds, if not thousands of years. Today, with our level of technology, these feuds are not going to last that long. Because sooner or later, some insane moron will use a dirty bomb with radioactive materials. And if that's too difficult to obtain, right, radioactive isotopes, I'm sure you could probably obtain them. They're used in medicine. You could probably obtain them on the black market and start building them up for dirty bombs that will contaminate cities for 20, 30 years forward. But some idiot will use a chemical weapon. Some idiot will use a biological weapon, right? Anthrax, whatever else, MRSA, some version of COVID. We have lots of people doing gain of function research in military biological labs or military-funded biolabs. We've already been through this, right? We should have learned those lessons. So if we keep on having this hate and these superiority complexes, then people will use that to justify using weapons of mass destruction against their opponents, whether it's their ethnic opponents, their religious opponents, or their racial opponents. And these days, it can be scary because creating chemical or biological weapons is not that expensive. And you don't need a PhD to be able to develop them. People probably with a appropriate high school education in chemistry or biology with the proper training could make those, right? Surreptitiously. So this is what we have to be afraid of. This is what we have to stay away from. My advice to Arabs and to Muslims: condemn war crimes on both sides. When I see that Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims are not condemning the atrocities that Hamas fighters committed on October 7th and October 8th in Israel, you've lost your moral ground. And you're not following the message of Muhammad. If you think that the message of a legitimate, truly enlightened prophet is, hey, it's okay to kill your opponent's women and children who are defenseless, then I think you've selected the wrong prophet, or you've misread his message, or that prophet was not a legitimate, true prophet. All right? No matter how you justify it, you cannot justify terrorist acts against women and children. As I've said before, if you captured people who you believed were illegal settlers on your land, then what's your obligation? Okay, you've basically committed a citizen's arrest, or you have authority from your local authority. You detain them, right? You have to humanely keep them in detention. You have to try them. Right, or then you have to release them to their government, to their country under certain terms. Right? We try, we have people serve sentence, then we deport them. Right? That's how the law works. Not by killing them. Oh, they're too weak, they're going to slow us down while we kidnap them to Gaza. Let's just shoot them in the border. You're a terrorist. You deserve to be shot for that. Right? Um, so if you're Arabs, Palestinians, or Muslims around the world, and you refrain from condemning these terrorist acts by saying, the Jews deserved it because they've been, harassing and discriminating and displacing and killing Palestinians for the last, 50 years, for the last years of existence of Israel. Folks, I have a wake-up call for you. If you have an issue with the Israeli army, with the Israeli police, and those are your targets, then those are your targets, but we still have rules of war, right? The ravers who were 18 or 20 years old at a rave, at that Nova rave, did they commit any of the atrocities, 20, 30, 40 years ago? No, they weren't even alive. Even if they're in the reserves of the Israeli army. They're not on duty, they're not armed. If you consider them soldiers, then you have to take them prisoner and apply Geneva Conventions to prisoners of war. You have to treat them humanely, feed them, clothe them, right? Give them medical care, and I guess sooner or later you'll wait for an exchange. But killing people, never an answer. And those who refuse to condemn this or who support it, then you've lost your humanity. You've lost your respect. And what you're going to do is you're going to justify atrocities being committed by the other side. Because we know how all this rolls. We know all the arguments. The arguments are very straightforward. They're animals, they're subhumans, they deserve this. And I hear this from both sides. And if they deserve it, then that's okay. Let them get a taste of their own medicine. Do two wrongs make a right? They never make a right. When we talk about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, we're talking about equal compensation for the injury inflicted. Doesn't mean, vengeance and retaliation and vigilantism, taking things into your own hand, right? Or going above and beyond your right to self-defense by using excessive force, okay? Or brutalizing, basically, your opponents, especially unarmed people. So, message to Israelis, hey, you better take care of your political leadership because they allowed this to happen October 7th. Either through sheer incompetence, which I doubt, because we know how competent Israeli intelligence and security apparatus is, and so are its armed forces. Or they allowed it to happen for political reasons and allowed people to be killed as sacrificial lambs, right? To justify further political action, right? Getting rid of Hamas because it's no longer useful. Dealing with the Gaza Strip. What are you going to do with it? Let's see if we can eventually convince someone. Did any of you read this Zionist plan of how, look, Egypt has 10 million free housing units. Let's give Egypt and the Gaza Palestinians money to relocate them to Egypt. We'll buy them all homes. Well, I don't know. I guess living in Hurghada would be, or in Sharm el-Sheikh would be nicer than living in the Gaza Strip. But some people will not take that money. They'll say, no, I'd rather live in, my house in the Gaza Strip because this is the land of my ancestors. And you can't force that upon them by saying, look, you either take the money and move or we completely demolish your neighborhood. And where you're going to live? You're going to live in rubble? Now it's an offer you can't refuse. Well, these are mafia, strong arm, organized crime tactics, right? These are not moral tactics of legitimately religious, righteous people. So, sorry, great plan if people voluntarily accept it. Sure, if the Israeli budget has the money for it, or other Israeli benefactors like the U.S. or the EU are willing to contribute and say, hey, if you're passing the Gaza Strip, we'll give you a residence permit and housing allowance and all this so you can live in Germany or in the U.S. And if the Palestinian says, you know what, I want a better future for my children. I'd like them to live for a while in Germany or the United States and get a good education and better work opportunities. I'm all for it. I mean, think of it. Jews lived outside of Israel for 2,000 years and we're all okay. We're willing to come back and did pretty well in the countries where we lived, with the exception of pogroms, right? So that has to be the approach. Regarding Jews worldwide, guys, obviously we have to support Israel because it's our homeland. But it doesn't mean we should support the discrimination, the persecution, the abuse of Palestinians, or their expulsion, or their disenfranchisement. And the very last thing we can ever support are human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity committed against Palestinians by Israeli armed forces, by Israeli police and security personnel, or by Israeli settlers who take the law into their own hands, start burning down Palestinian homes in the West Bank, Palestinian cars, tree orchards, attacking Palestinians, taking advantage of their right to carry arms while Palestinians are unarmed unless they're, local Fatah militants. They are carrying weapons illegally as far as Israeli law is concerned and could be shot and killed on sight by Israeli soldiers. We as Jews around the world cannot support when Israeli soldiers start using snipers to kill rock throwers, start using unarmed civilians who are trying to cross the border like they did a couple of years ago. Or I guess that was even more than that now, right? We cannot support that when Israeli soldiers are beating women or children while they're detaining them. Okay. If this is what we support, then we've lost our moral, spiritual compass. In other words, don't support things that you wouldn't want done to your family or in your neighborhood. If you are a Jew who lives in the United States, in Europe, in South America, in Russia, Eastern Europe, Eurasia, Australia, would you want your local police doing this to your family because you're a Jew? Detaining you, beating you, humiliating you. And if your kid, throws a rock at a police car, the police shoot him in return? Have you seen that in Paris or during some of these other riots in the U.S.? Well, people throw rocks at police and police start shooting back at them. Although theoretically or formally the police have the right to use lethal force against rocks, which rocks are a lethal missile, a lethal weapon that can kill police officers. But we don't see doing that. And we cannot approve this being done against Palestinians. We cannot approve collective punishment schemes. And this is a message to every member of this conflict, every participant. Jews, Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims in general, Persians. You cannot use collective punishment. If some guy is radicalized enough to, kill a Jew, to kill a Muslim, that doesn't give you the right to punish his family members or to demolish their home. Oh, we demolished. What, did the house only belong to him? Right? If he's the owner of the house and he's a terrorist, then you have legal confiscation schemes, legal criminal forfeiture as part of restitution, right? But if only 1/10 of the house belongs to him, people are raising homes. Oh, you're a terrorist. We're gonna, or even neighboring houses, right? What did we see in Israel recently? Some Palestinian idiot, and I'm sorry, but I'm calling you an idiot, the owner of this pizza shop, put this advertisement using that poor old Israeli woman that the Hamas militants were taking photos with. I hope they didn't harm her. And this guy put this on his pizza shop poster. You're a moron. For that, you deserve to get a prison sentence for supporting extremism and terrorism. But it doesn't mean that the Israeli army just drives up and uses a bulldozer and takes down your shop. That's taking the law into your own hands. Although I guess in times of military conflict, when you have emergency law or martial law, maybe that's allowed, but I don't think they had that in Israel. So let's not do collective punishment, right? Especially if the pizza shop also belonged to other people in his family, right? Who never supported this stupid poster. But collective punishment cannot be used. You also cannot, and this hurts again, what has recently been happening in Syria. Obviously, Israel has taken the Golan Heights away from Syria for strategic military reasons. Not to mention the water that you get from the Golan Heights. But Israel has also been intermittently bombing Syrian targets, Syrian airports, the Syrian Air Force. Why? Because the Syrian government is opposed to Israel. And Israel can get away with it because Syria is too weak to respond in kind to Israel. So if you're an Israeli or a Jew and you support this, say, wow, Assad is evil. Did Assad support Al Qaeda? Did Assad support ISIS? No, he was actually opposed against these terrorist organizations, some of whom were set up with CIA funding, Mossad funding, and logistical support and political support for other political reasons. So you can't support that. Same thing. If you live in Iran, right, and you're a peaceful, law-abiding citizen of Iran, and you start to hate Israel as a state, and you believe it doesn't have the right to exist, please reconsider. Okay? You can hate Israel for the actions that you think it did wrong in terms of discrimination against Palestinians or, not following certain UN mandates. But you can't say, for that the state deserves to cease to exist. Imagine if more powerful governments start to use that against Iran. You've already been through this where, the Shah of Iran was completely controlled by the U.S. And look at the atrocities he committed. Right? And that caused a backlash, and eventually the Ayatollahs came to power. You had an Islamic revolution. 78, 79. There were some pros and some cons to that revolution. Right? When you have a fundamentalist political authority and power, it's going to have very strict religious rules. It's not going to allow lots of secular things. There are pros and there are cons to that. But you would not want the U.S. to say, since we consider Iran to be our enemy, what we're going to do is we're going to attack Iran now. And that gives us, we believe that Iran supports Hezbollah, and therefore we're going to start bombing and destroying Iranian oil refineries. Basically the lifeline of the Iranian economy, oil exports, oil gas exports. And we won't just destroy the refineries, we'll also hit the oil fields, the pipelines that lead from the oil fields to the refineries. And we'll also hit the export terminals that are used to load oil or gas into tankers. And then we're also going to do a blockade against, Iran being able to export any oil. We'll choke your economy like we choked the economies of Cuba or Venezuela as much as we could. Would you want that? Of course you would want that. So don't give any ammunition to your opponents by having radical, drastic views against a particular religion or a particular ethnicity. Because if your political or religious leaders start espousing hate against Judaism, against Jews, against the state of Israel, or against Christians, or America, right, as a secular nation, that's going to have consequences. You can criticize, but you have to be careful. And that's not going to build peace. I'm all for the independence of Iran. As long as Iran doesn't start presenting a military threat to its neighbors, right? Or a military threat to Israel. And if you have leaders who go, well, it's okay. Small, compact country Israel, we have enough missiles to wipe it off. We're not going to touch Jerusalem because it's the holy city for all religions and Al-Aqsa Mosque. But we're going to take out everything else, right? We're not going to hit the West Bank, won't hit Gaza, but we'll target Israeli cities. You're going to commit war crimes when you do that. That can never be supported. Nothing good of it will come of it for Iran because Israel will also retaliate if necessary with nuclear weapons. And, unless you want your city looking like Hiroshima or Nagasaki in Japan, which was also a war crime, by the way, you would never support that. And by the way, even when you fight evil, it doesn't justify war crimes. Since we spoke about, I just mentioned Nagasaki and Hiroshima, let's mention the cities that were firebombed by the Allies during World War II. Hamburg in Germany, Dresden, then the firebombing of Tokyo, where the military leadership that ordered those bombing raids knew full well that they were targeting mostly civilians and civilian infrastructure. And the justification for this it was an ideological justification. What we're going to do is we're going to kill all these Germans, We're going to kill all these Japanese to make their military cringe, to make their military leaders cringe, to completely destroy morale among the population to support a war. And this will, this will break down their fighting spirit and we'll win faster. And if we have to, burn alive 100,000 people, why not? By the way, Dresden was firebombed, if I'm not mistaken, like 3 days before the Soviets came in. Soviet army came in. Firebombing of Hamburg, well, Hamburg was a major port, but you target military targets. So all this stuff comes around and it goes around, and we have to break this vicious circle. I think that's about it. We have to wrap up. Pass on this message, share it with people. I guess I'll do timestamps so you can listen to particular sections. But what all of us have to do today, on October 25th, is to put an immediate end to the loss of innocent life, especially women and children. That means Hamas, you're going to have to stop launching rockets into Israel. These aren't guided rockets that are targeting particular military targets, legitimate military targets. They're headed into directions of cities, and wherever they land, they land. You have to stop that because that's a war crime. And if you're if you're a Gaza resident who has any influence on Hamas, tell them, say, guys, you're not helping us, because this will give Israel justification to do the same thing to us. And look what they've already done since October 7th. They've, half of Gaza City, if not more, is already leveled. And the carnage continues. So immediate ceasefire for both sides. If you're Jewish and Israeli, or you're from any other country that has influence on Israel, well, let's try to make it known to our political leaders that we will not support providing military aid that's used to commit war crimes, right? Everyone is for legitimate military aid for a country to defend itself, but not for a country that's committing war crimes or is using military aid to defend a regime that's basically committing crimes against humanity, discriminating against people, persecuting people for faith, for ethnicity, race, and anything. Don't use military aid to support crimes or to support basically criminal regimes. Let's try to use our influence as taxpayers, as voters, even as consumers. As consumer, boycott companies that are facilitating the commission of these crimes. And all of us, if we want this to go to an end, we also have to understand how propaganda works. When you have large financial industrial groups control major news outlets, and these same groups control governments, you're going to get the same propaganda message, but supposedly from 20 different, supposedly independent sources. They're not independent because they're owned basically by the same group, okay? So we have to encourage independent journalism, not just encourage it, but support it financially, and we also have to defend journalists. Because the other thing that we've seen in this conflict is journalists being targeted to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. When snipers, when people in artillery, people in aviation, people who are operating drones start targeting journalists because they don't want the footage going out of the crimes that they're committing, this cannot be supported. These people must be held accountable, identified, arrested, investigated, prosecuted. It's that simple for every side of the conflict. Same thing when people start targeting medical personnel or personnel of, nonprofit humanitarian disaster relief organizations. Any moral degenerate who thinks it's okay to target medical personnel because these medical personnel aren't just treating civilians, but they're also treating your military opponents, I'm sorry, you're a moral degenerate. And if you've hurt them or killed them, you deserve to be prosecuted, imprisoned, if not shot for it. That goes for all sides. Same thing with relief workers. When you see people bringing in food, water, medicine, you don't target those people. Just like you don't target medical facilities, right? You don't target schools. You don't target buildings that are identified as particular refugee centers or shelters, whether it's UN sponsored or by some other organization. You don't target workers who work for volunteers for the Red Cross or the Red Crescent or other disaster or humanitarian relief organizations, right? These people are off limits. Not only are they non-combatants, but they're there to help protect civilians, to feed them, to treat them, to evacuate them, to give them psychological support and everything else, okay? And certain facilities are off limits. If you believe that your enemy soldiers are hiding under a hospital or in a school, right? And at the same time that facility is still housing children or the sick, patients, then you don't have the right to bomb it. You're going to have to eventually go in, right, and engage in combat with these people. Now it's a police anti-terrorist action. I mean, think of it. Imagine if in your city, a group of terrorists takes over a hospital or a school or a theater. You're going to go, well, I want to kill the 20 terrorists. I don't care if I'm going to kill the 20 children that are holding hostage or 100 theater goers or 100 patients. If you do that, then you're a degenerate, okay? And if you talk to moral, righteous, brave soldiers, law enforcement personnel, they'll say, we'll take our chances of potentially risking our lives to rescue hostages, right? And to neutralize or detain terrorists that are using these facilities as shields. It's that simple. So right away, on October 25th, what we all have to do is demand an immediate ceasefire from both sides. And after a ceasefire, you have to have negotiations. And negotiations have to be reasonable. In other words, if either side says, the other side doesn't have the right to have its own state or its own government, this is not constructive, it's not morally defensible. So you have to work out a solution where you have two states, where you have equal rights for people, equal protection, you don't have discrimination, you don't have persecution based on ethnicity, based on religion, or the passport that you carry, right? Or the race that you have. It has to be that way. Otherwise, we will never have peace in the Holy Land. And by continuing to persecute people, we're continuing to desecrate our Holy Land. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. And I hope you support it.